All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our second ever Center for Racial Justice Summer Institute. So I wanted to say a few things, but first, just to begin with thanks. I always say that it's not ethnic studies if it doesn't come with a struggle. And even in this moment, some more than half a century after the struggle for ethnic studies was initiated by the three people to my left and others, we're still fighting for ethnic studies. And it's a sense of urgency in the present that compelled us to develop this particular summer institute around the theme of localizing ethnic studies. And we've done so in community, in solidarity, and in partnership with so many of you who are here in this room. So I wanted to say that from the CRJ end, I really wanted to thank Domingo, Keiko, and M. And from the Resource Center for Nonviolence end, I really wanted to thank Sylvia and Io. And I want to say something too, which is that, this has been a hell of a year, quite frankly. And it's been a time in which it's been hard for those of us who even have a formal connection with the university to be able to avail ourselves of the resources at the university. It has meant the world to us, Sylvia, that you have opened up the doors of RCNV. And so this is an incredible space that enables us to do this kind of work, as well as to come together to organize. And this also follows on a series that took place here at RCNV this entire past year. And it was a series on the foundations of ethnic studies. And again, thank you so much for opening the doors of RCNV and collaborating with us every step of the way. So I want to speak a little bit about the days today and the 2 days ahead. And I wanted to say too that, just really like ethnic studies, on the one hand, we are at a very different place in this historical moment. Since the year 2000, California has been a majority minority state. And so we have demographic arguments on our side, and yet we're still fighting for ethnic studies, even during a time in which there is a law passed, AB 101, that mandates the teaching of ethnic studies in K through 12 education. And what we've realized, and we knew this going into this, that this moment of ethnic studies expansion actually signals a moment of profound danger, not only overt hostile attack, and there is that, but also co-optation. And so this is why I think having a discussion around the kind of political vision that animated ethnic studies in its inception is so critical, because we are in a historical moment in which the term ethnic studies, stripped of its history of the fight for the third world college, is construed as a free-for-all ethnicity studies. And it's such a free-for-all that it's also viewed as admitting and having a place for repressive ethno-nationalisms. And so I think having clarifying conversations where and when possible are of the highest order of urgency right now. So This is to say, thank you so much. There's so many familiar faces here. Thank you so much for steadfastly bringing your wisdom, your strength, and your commitment to this struggle. So today we are so lucky to have 3 veterans of the Third World Liberation Front strike, and I will introduce them in just a moment. I think that we tend to think of, people usually say, oh, I got politicized when I went to college, or, I discovered that I was an Asian American when I went to college. But few people understand that there were people who came before who actually coined the term Asian American, and not simply as a kind of inert descriptor of a demographic, but as a political site of convergence, solidarity, and organizing. And that's also history that oftentimes gets stripped. And they also don't understand that the people who went to SF State, who went to Berkeley, in many cases brought with them histories of organizing in local communities, and that includes Salinas and the Central Coast. Tomorrow, we have 2 sessions, one in the morning and one after lunch. And the morning session will be a presentation by Alfonso Taboada, and that will focus on ethnic studies in Coachella. So during this time in which there is an ethnic studies law that has been passed, there has been movement all across the state to develop ethnic studies, and there have been different sites that have been in the vanguard. And it's always come with a struggle, even when there is the local demographics have people of color far and away in the majority. And so why is it that we here in Santa Cruz County, both north and south, have been struggling to get ethnic studies realized, to have it be a field that is accountable to the communities that it should be by all rights serving? So it's really important for us to look at examples of places where there has been struggle, but at a place like Coachella, did you know that Coachella has 14 ethnic studies courses on the books, and they're developing ethnic studies courses in science and in the arts? That's an impressive record. So we will be in conversation with someone who was an anchoring figure for that, who also comes from a long legacy of struggle. People don't come to this work from nowhere. They come from somewhere, right? And I think having a place-based articulation of ethnic studies is so important. In the afternoon, different members of Pajaro Valley for Ethnic Studies and Justice will be speaking about our current struggle to get ethnic studies realized in Watsonville, which is a school, the PVUSD is almost 90% Latinx. Yet people who have stated that they do not agree with 99% of the people in the district have been able to tank and hold up and suspend the realization of ethnic studies. And on the very last day, Wednesday, we are going to be joining forces with many people from different community organizations. And we have a task for ourselves, which is how do we build out an ethnic studies curriculum that is responsible to all the community struggle, past and present, that has occurred locally. And to that end, we are going to be co-constructing an ethnic studies curriculum together. And we do that by asking ourselves, what constitutes a people's archive of our struggles? And from that basis, and we know that that doesn't look like dominant archives, right? And from that basis, we build a curriculum that could be taught locally, and that could be taught at the university, and could be taught both in formal sites of education and in sites of community organizing. And so I just wanted to say this thing, one last thing before we move to our discussion for today, which is that in a place like Santa Cruz, and I describe Santa Cruz as ideologically white, and I say that because saying that it's ideologically white actually accounts for the fact that it's not as though there aren't and haven't been communities of color here. When you have an agricultural industry, you have a revolving door of migrant labor of color that's been exploited, chewed up, and then spit out, right? And so how is it that we could actually, instead of stating that, you know what, instead of like, first of all, acceding to the notion that this is a place of for only the wealthy and only vacationers from across the hill, now Silicon Valley, instead of acceding to the idea that this is a place where, you know, there's a happiness tax because there's surf, there's sun, there's great organic food, there's redwoods. Come on, come and enjoy yourselves. Instead, to look at how was the wealth of this area built up? How was it accumulated? What histories of racial and colonial violence are implied there? And what have been the histories of community resistance? And so this is the kind of ethnic studies that we want to build up here, one that reflects local histories of struggle. And because ethnic studies is praxis and orientation, you don't just learn something, you learn and you simultaneously act. We understand that a localized, place-based ethnic studies that is responsive to local communities will have a transformative effect on this local area. And the powers that be understand that that's the case. That is why we are met by so much opposition. So without further ado, I want to actually welcome our guests of honor, and this is the leading event or session of our 3-day Summer Institute. I'd like to introduce, you know, these are also, these are people for whom I have the highest respect because they undertook such enormous risk and they paid the price and they led the way. They led the way, too, in a historic time, a revolutionary juncture, where all sorts of state violence was being unleashed on anyone who was doing the kind of organizing that they were. They, moreover, started this organizing as youth in Salinas. And so I'll begin, I'll go in order. So to my left is Lillian Fabros Bando. Lillian Fabros Bando was born in the Philippines. She grew up mainly in Alizal. This was a working class division of Salinas, California, during a time when Salinas, against our sort of sense of it today, was majority white, right? Her family worked in the fields as onion bunchers, strawberry, lettuce, and tomato pickers, and other farm work, and this also included Lillian. After graduating from Salinas High School, Lillian went to UC Berkeley, where she was active in anti-Vietnam work and Third World activities. She was a founding member of the Asian American Political Alliance, aka APA, in 1968. After graduating from Berkeley in the early 70s, she went on to Columbia University and became active in the Asian American movement with students at CCNY. In 72, she returned to the West Coast, to the Bay Area, San Francisco, and worked in Soma with Filipino groups, Project Hanapin, and youth organizations. She then moved to Los Angeles to attend UCLA School of Social Welfare, and she worked with Royal Morales at the Asian American Mental Health Training Center. And these kinds of mutual aid spaces were developed by third world organizers during this time. This wasn't a pre-existing infrastructure. Asian American movements against, she also was involved in Asian American movements against Little Tokyo redevelopment. She was involved in anti-Marcos groups and other Filipino, Japanese, and Chinese community actions. She graduated in the late 70s with a master's in social welfare, went on to graduate from UCLA Law School in 1985, and practiced as an attorney for almost 20 years. Now retired, Lillian volunteers with Filipino organizations in LA and helps her husband with gardening. And she often says she's sort of come full circle from like onion bunching back into doing gardening. Okay.
Correction.
Oh, yeah.
This is not just gardening. My husband has been a gardener, has a route for the last, 55 years. And so I remember at one point helping him on his route, because I'm retired and had nothing else had planned. I'm digging in the ground and I'm picking up the stuff and I start laughing. And I said, I've come full circle. But this time, I'm voluntarily, digging the earth, whereas before, when I was younger and a child, I was forced to. But that's my comment about it's not gardening in the backyard.
Yeah, thank you. So to the left of Lillian is Vicci Wong. Vicci, you are larger than life, really, like just such a force to be reckoned with. Vicci was born and bred, and I think you can hear Vicci's voice in this writing too, in the salad bowl to the world, Salinas, California, as a child farm laborer. She co-founded the Salinas chapter of the National Farm Workers Association, as well as SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, while also active in the movement against the Vietnam War, draft, and nukes. In her teens, she went on to co-found APA, the Asian American Political Alliance, and the Third World Liberation Front. I mean, all of these guys were recruiting people to join the Third World struggle. After graduating from Berkeley, she moved to San Francisco's Chinatown and Manilatown, where she organized immigrants, tenants, and retail, clerical, sweatshop workers, and co-founded the I Hotel Basement. She founded the first ever Asian Film Festival and co-founded, I love this revolutionary spirit, the May 4th Singers, the first Asian American cultural group. She was the lead singer in several revolutionary bands, such as the Chi-Town Fighting Machine, Thunder Road, and this is very true if you look at their police records, repeat offenders. Vicci was, it's a point of pride. Vicci was a longtime reporter and editor. Her books include What Have Women Done? Soldiers and Strikers, A Pictorial History of Chinese Working People in America, Stand Up, an archive collection of the Bay Area Asian American movement. That's actually 1968 to 1974. I've taught from that. It's really excellent. And The Global Struggle for Oil. She keeps sane by laughing a lot at herself mostly. Okay, and to the left of Vicci is Adna Louie. Adna was born in Hong Kong before immigrating to San Francisco's Chinatown in July of 1948. She and her family moved to Salinas in 1950. This is a very different time then, with Fort Ord in its heyday, right? And this being a major deployment site to US wars in Asia. Her father worked many different jobs, and her mother worked in a laundry and peeled green onions until the pair were able to make payments on a small restaurant in 1959. So she and her family lived, and this is sort of typical of a lot of immigrant families, in the attached living quarters in the back. And it's interesting because in many ways, this restaurant also served as a kind of third space like RCNV, really a space of convergence. The restaurant demanded so much of her family's attention that her parents had to put her youngest brothers into foster care for several years, which was exceedingly difficult for the family. And one of these brothers was also really involved in TWLF. So we have to trace that kind of early experience to an acute consciousness of structural injustice that motivates people to organize. She graduated from Salinas High School and attended San Jose State until dropping out to get married. After that marriage failed, she became a single mother to 2 children, raising them for over a decade. She earned a living during this time working in retail. She and her current partner have been together for over 30 years. She has 3 beautiful grandchildren who are the delight of her life. And she has stated that she is forever grateful to her parents and her ancestors for providing her siblings and her with just the possibility to dream, right? To dream through hard work, devotion, and incredible personal sacrifice. And so please join me in welcoming our wonderful guests of honor, and we will be engaging in a conversation together. So I'm going to skip over some of the first slides, and we'll come back to them. Sorry, so they're in sequence, but I certainly can do this. So as I was saying, like many people think of people's coming to consciousness as associated time-wise with being in college. Yet the 3 of you came of age as really like child labor and anti-war organizers while you were still in Salinas. Vicci and Lillian, you co-founded the Salinas chapter of the United Farm Workers, and as I mentioned before, all 3 of you have honorable records of repeat arrest. And so I wondered if we could begin, and I was wondering, let me go to this. Vicci and Lillian, could you speak about what prompted you? We'll come to this in a moment. Yes, but could you speak about what prompted you to organize around labor? And again, you're not coming to this out of nowhere, but you're coming to labor organizing in your youth in an area where there have been many, many generations of communities of color that have organized, have sought to unionize, have sought to come together in solidarity, because this area has depended upon labor exploitation of people of color. So could you speak about what kind of local histories and what kind of conditions locally informed your decision to reach out to Dolores Huerta? And in fact, actually, let me see. I think that let me actually backtrack. I got a little bit confused because we were resequencing at the last minute. I'm sorry about this. So what I want to do is, why don't we just do this? So I was going to ask, and let me say, we'll return to this question. My apologies. So I wanted to say that some social movement historians and I won't name them because I don't want to irritate you, Vicci. Some social movement historians, WW, but okay, never mind. Okay, yeah, who shall go unnamed, have gotten the history of radical Asian American organizing at UC Berkeley quite wrong. We'll return to this later. They've made a kind of blanket statement that whereas TWLF organizing at SF State was principally working class in character, that at UC Berkeley it was strongly middle class in nature. And whereas at SF State it's understood and widely recognized that BSU took the lead at SF State, APA was in the lead at Berkeley. And so this narrative has oftentimes gone unquestioned, but this is where it's so important to localize the Third World Liberation Front strike beyond San Francisco and beyond Berkeley, and to bring it back to agricultural areas throughout California where many of the organizers hailed, right? And this includes the Central Coast. And so part of our conversation today is understanding how the racialized labor exploitation that characterized the Central Coast and Salinas is critical to understanding the prehistory of TWLF. And so I want to just read from, and we'll go back to APA in a moment, but I'll just read this. And this is from APA Perspectives in the late 60s. It's from the newsletter. And I want to read this because I think it's so interesting. Okay. The Asian American Political Alliance is people. It is a people's alliance to effect social and political changes. We believe that American society is historically racist and one which has systematically employed social discrimination and economic imperialism, both domestically and internationally, exploiting all non-white people in the process of building up their affluent society. Okay, exploitation, but no at all distribution of the gains of that labor exploitation. They did so at the expense of all of us. Uncontrolled capitalism. I want us to think about this because this is an articulation of ethnic studies against which we're getting milquetoast versions of ethnic studies right now. Uncontrolled capitalism has pushed all of the non-white people into a social position so that only manual jobs with subhuman pay are open to them. Consequently, we have been psychologically so conditioned by the blue-eyed, blonde-haired standard that many of us have lost our perspective. We can only survive if we know our place, shut up, and accept what we are given. We resent this kind of domination, and we are determined to change. And so few people know that the Three Musketeers of Salinas were the precursors to APA. So you all came of age in the ghetto of Alisal. This was a crucible where people of color were forced to reside when Salinas was a majority white town. And Vicci, you have eloquently described it as a white, racist, reactionary milieu that we Three Musketeers sprouted out of. So can you reflect on how the statement that I just read did not arise out of nowhere, but was conditioned by your lived experiences in Alisal? Can you speak about the labor that you performed as children to help your families get by? And so I'd like to begin with you, Lillian. if you don't mind.
Oh, it's me.
Yes.
One of my earliest memories is that my mother and father would work in the fields, and one time they were working in onion bunching sheds. So after work, they would bring home these boxes of vegetables, of green onions, and then after dinner, we'd all work several more hours to make some more money. All the kids were. And at times when we'd work out in a shed, the inspectors would come, and so it's like run. So you see all these little kids who are working illegally, we'd go run out into the fields and then lay flat in between the furrows and hope they didn't see us. Well, of course they can see us, right? Because you can't have child labor. And so, you can't get a job other than working in the fields if you were Filipino. And so even though my father had worked as a farm worker and then joined the US Army for World War II and got US citizenship that way, and then was able to bring over my mother, and we started a Filipino community, because before, a lot of the Filipino farm workers were bachelors because of the laws barring immigration and anti-miscegenation laws. A number of them, even after the Army, like my father, when they were left the Army and came back to Salinas, couldn't get a job again. And so he went back to working in the fields. And so that's what my parents did. And I grew up with that. And, just knowing there was no future, we could never advance beyond Salinas. So that's my experience working as a child labor. And I can talk about later on about why we were more advanced and, really pushing for organizing, becoming aware, working out in the fields, and like knowing that there was really no future in there for us.
Yeah, and is there anything that you'd like to share about these images? These come from your personal archive.
My mother is one of the rare photographs, I think it's at the top. That's my mother and my aunt, because you don't take pictures, they want to look nice. You're not going to take a picture of them working in the fields or working in a shed. And I think I went to see her when I was in college. And I went to see them, and they just didn't want me to take their pictures. So I took a picture of her and my aunt, where they were working. Like, who does that? And so that's a picture of her. And then this one is of me in high school. I was after work sometime, just posed and took a picture. The other picture, I think, is of my father when we were in Salinas, and we were very young. And I don't think this one showed us, but some of them, I was with my uncles. I called them uncles, but a lot of them were unmarried, but they, are part of our community. And then I guess the other picture is like a lot of us had a small Filipino community and would dance Filipino dances, and I think that's what the youngest one is all about. So that's what those photographs are all about.
You also have spoken about the fact that your mom would bring work home.
Yes. So then I just like, and the smell of like raw vegetables picked from the earth, there's this smell that clings to you. And so we just would have dinner and then clear the table, and we would all start working, however young we were, because you can make a few more bucks from your kids and the family that would be added on to that. And that was very common. And I remember at one point I was living with my grandmother, and this is when people started to organize. And I lived with her in Soledad, and my other uncles, other Filipinos, and the owner of the farm had this big old barn that horses used to live in, and they had converted it the stalls where the men could work. And at some point it was dirt, and at some point they made it cement, so you'd have, instead of like dirt on the floor. And then they had no doors on it before, so they hung blankets. And right next to it was a cowshed where my grandmother and grandfather lived, and I would go stay with them. And I thought it was pretty nice. It's a little cowshed with your own, like, you didn't just have a room, you had a TV, you had a a living room. And I remember at one point working in, I think, Chular, and I had to go back and get my paperwork in Soledad. So I went to my grandmother's house, and one of the women there was, people would come in to try to organize us, right, and to unionize us. And she said, I'll give you a ride back to pick up the paperwork. So I brought her back to this big old dilapidated barn, and it looked empty. And I thought it was a nice cow shed. I mean, come on in, come on in. And she goes, and she had this horrified look on her face. And I remember, I think it was like 14 to 15, I was so hurt by it that she could not hide, maybe she felt unsafe, maybe she was just horrified how bad it was, but I thought it was compared to what it was before. And I always remember that, just in terms of like, don't do that, right? I was being hospitable. I thought I was enthusiastic. And so when people like, it's one of those things you teach social work student, somebody offers you something, eat the food. Somebody offers you their home, welcome in, right? Suck it up. But I all these years later, I just remembered how it made me feel. And actually kind of spilled over to Berkeley. I broke my leg and I was in the hospital and my parents came to visit me. I was mortified. They brought lettuce, they brought tomatoes, they brought strawberries because they wanted to share it with everybody. And I was mortified because I thought people were going to make fun of us. Because that's happened when they find out what you do or your family does, people make fun of us. But actually the hospital staff were very nice about it, and I just felt, oh, okay, they're not making fun of my parents. But that's just like, even though we're organizing and we're fighting for a union, it's people's reactions to what your background is. I don't know. Just a lot of those images just came back.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore some of the things that you're saying. One, it's that this is, from W.E.B. Du Bois onward, when he's talking about double consciousness as, that Blackness and the condition of being Black in the United States always encodes a perception of oneself through the lens of whiteness and dominant, the dominant sort of power structure of the society. And what you're saying, Lillian, is that we oftentimes have these moments where we have an estranged view of ourselves, where we're looking at ourselves through the lens of, in this instance, you're saying that she was a white social worker. She's, a kind of do-gooder of society, yet her judgment is palpable. She's terrified to even go into your home, and then the other thing that I wanted to point out too is you're speaking about how you thought that this home was nice because compared to many of the Manon who were without families and not living in places as nice as your family was living in, that, it was all sort of like relative. But this also makes us realize if someone is living in a converted barn and they follow the seasonal cycle of the crops, and they are legally bound not to have the capacity to reproduce a citizen generation, then they are rendered, even as they are economically essential, everything structurally ensures that their political undesirability results in their exclusion even as they are here. And so it raises a question for all of us. How do we construct a people's archive of throwaway people? What do they leave behind? What kind of material culture exists, if any? And then how do we start to think about what doesn't exist as a question that we have to actively undertake? So, Vicci, I would love for you to speak about coming of age in this white, racist, reactionary milieu that the Three Musketeers sprouted out of.
Is this on?
It is.
Is it on?
Yeah.
You never guess I used to sing with a mic all the time. Anyway, you know, we all grew up under shadows, right? Our story is how we diminish those shadows that control us and how we learn to cast our own shadows to guide us forward. That's what it was like when I was thinking about this whole thing about Salinas. I really appreciate Christine, by the way, for localizing ethnic studies in the whole founding of the Asian American movement and the Liberation Front in struggles that happened again before that. And the shadows that we faced in Salinas are very mythic. And I realized, because do you know that 60% of the produce in this country comes from Salinas? 60%. Most of your lettuce, your strawberries, celery, tomatoes, artichokes come from this one little pretty ignored area. And for the most part, I could vouch for why it should be ignored. But it's an amazing area. Plus, it's sort of the heart of the agricultural, in what we used to call in the 60s, the military industrial complex. Because right next door, only 15, 20 minutes away, at that time was Fort Ord, the largest military base in the country, where during the Korean War, it was a staging ground for US troops. During the occupation of Asia and from Taiwan to Korea, all the troops were stationed there before they went sent to Asia. And then, of course, during the Vietnam War, where they would have up to 50,000 troops there. So again, no coincidence, we began our anti-draft, anti-war activities in Fort Ord. So you have the shadow of the largest military base in the country. And if you don't know if you think things are rotten now in terms of the USA, and we're hearing it again also because of the Olympics, you can't believe what it was like back then in the early 60s, for the late 50s when we grew up. And right after World War II, all the rah-rah, USA, number one, you know, baby. This is it. We got condemned because we formed the Beatlemaniacs fan club. That was considered subversive back then. How dare you like these 30 long-haired hippie types from a foreign country? You're supposed to only listen to the Beach Boys. And we did. We liked them too at the time. And we didn't see why we had to pit each other, you know, one band against another. But that was, again, the milieu, the shadow that we were living under. You had to pick a side, and it was all American, red, white, and blue. And we had also this growing, beside that, there was Soledad Prison, the Salinas Valley Prison, but we all called it Soledad Prison, which was, you know, again, later you heard about the Soledad brothers. But so and I grew up in a small farm my father had for a while until he lost it. This is the farm right there. My father, I don't know, it's hard, I can't see it from here. It was the bottom of a dried up lake bed, which is the only reason why my father was even could afford to buy it, because nobody else wanted it, because it would get flooded almost every year and wipe out all our crops. And right next door on the side where you see cornfields, there were also cows and everything, was the Monterey County Sheriff's Farm. And that's where prisoners were. So every day I grew up with my brothers and sisters working alongside prisoners, and they would just hop over the barbed wire fence, and we were all very friendly. We'd go up, run up to the store up the hill a couple of miles away, and get cigarettes for them, and we'd exchange corn for our vegetables to them. We mainly grew green onions. And so I got exposed to working with prisoners pretty early on, and we were actually got along really well, even though some of them tried to escape, but again, they never tried to hurt our family or anything when we later built a house on the field. So that was another thing, working with prisoners, and why I got more interested later on when we got arrested and other things, working with prison reform as well. But so I had that background too, and that shadow of the prison. And my grandfather, I never met him because he was too ashamed. He was incarcerated at San Quentin for murder, my mother's father. So we never met him because he never wanted any of us to visit him. He died a broken man, and he was acquitted towards the last couple of months. Somebody actually came forward and confessed to the murder, but anyway, that's a whole other story. So I have this whole prison thing back in my background, as well as my own personal arrest. But so that's another shadow. So you have, the biggest military, agriculture, industrial, because it was the industry. No small farms like my father's could survive under that. And we're coming from World War II, the Cold War is happening, nukes. Now, that was a big thing back then as part of the anti-war movement, nuclear power and using nukes. And Barry Goldwater, the Republican candidate, a precedent for MAGA today with the John Birch Society, which we'll get into at some other point, I guess. Anyway, that was the other thing we grew up, the most reactionary, right-wing government dominating all of Monterey County, completely different from what I understand is like today, where Salinas is considered one of the most liberal, or Monterey County is considered more, liberal democratic. At that time, we volunteered to work for peace candidates. We were like 12 at the time or something, so we couldn't even vote. So I asked for the list of Democrats registered in our area, in the whole of LSL. You know how many names were there? 12. Less than a row. That's how conservative Salinas was at the time. We had 12 registered Democrats. So it didn't take long to knock on their doors. But anyway, that's the John Birch Society, which is, for people unfamiliar, it was the more palatable form of the KKK. Their office was moved right next door to our main public library, where people like us who had no books at home and had no place to even study would go at night to do our homework and everything. So that, again, is the backdrop of all the stuff, our shadow that we had growing up in a place like Salinas. So I don't want to take up any more time, but I just wanted to give an idea of what we were growing up and why with the labor, when I was a farm worker too with Lillian, and we worked bunch onions. And my thing, I always remember, and I think about it now, is I started out on my father's farm hoeing weeds. So we use different type hoes to hoe different weeds. And it's just like picking strawberries, it's just one of the worst things to do because you have to bend really low to get those damn strawberries for people like you to eat. And it's just backbreaking work. And so hoeing the weeds, and I always remember hoeing that hoe. And I have this image, again, part of my shadow story, as I've learned once I co-founded the Asian American movement. I remember the light that went off in my head when he finally said, hey, because we grew up in a colorless world too. It was a white world, and then it became black and white with the Black Power movement. And people like us, we had no place in it. Where do we fit? We don't fit anywhere. And so I picked up that hoe, and now I'm hoeing. I held the hoe up high, and now I'm hoeing the weeds that are keeping us down. That's
Hammer
how
and
I
hoe.
felt
Yep.
when people asked me how did I feel when I was in that meeting when Asian American Political Alliance was formed, because I saw all of our struggles from the past in Salinas
Yeah.
in that one moment, and it does go back to
Yeah.
my root with the soil and our
Yeah.
relationship to the whole, you know, what we had grown up and
Yeah.
what now we can. So I say we learn to cast our own shadows.
Yeah. You know, Vicci, you've also spoken about the fact that growing up, um, going home from school didn't represent going home to rejuvenate yourself. You indicated that it was going to school that was a break and a reprieve from the unremitting work outside school. And so that's another shadow as well. And you were mentioning that, you know, your father was only able to purchase the worst possible plot of land. And it reminds me of even the history here in Santa Cruz and Chinatown, which is located where Mobo Sushi and Trader Joe's is located right now, that it was placed there next to the San Lorenzo River because the San Lorenzo River would reliably overrun its banks on a near annual basis, thus clearing out those homes. And it also reminds me of the fact, like when you're saying what sort of place is there for Chinese people, for Asians in this country, in which historically we were racialized as alien, right? So, like, what kind of place do we have? Chinatowns, it was an advance when Chinatowns, all of a sudden the buildings were constructed in brick. Because prior to that, when Chinatowns, the buildings were constructed with wood, that was how the driving outs would happen. The driving outs were a form of lynching. Many, many different communities of color were lynched. And so you would have um, people burnt out of Chinatown, right? So, I mean, I think you're raising to the fore this local history because people don't usually think of Salinas and think of Asians, right? And there was also a strong Japanese population as well. Right? Adna, I wonder if we can go to you and if you could, yeah, if you could speak.
That's my dad's restaurant.
Would you mind holding up your mic?
Hello?
Yes, it's on. It's
Okay, that's my dad's restaurant on Market Street, and up the street, across the street from each other, are two fruit stand gangs. There were fights there, gunshot things, but fortunately, when I was going to junior high school, my close friends were Mexican girlfriends of the gang leaders, so we didn't get shot the whole time my brothers and I were going to junior high or high school there, our restaurants, so that was great. Okay. And in the corner, that's my mom, my dad, my poo, that's my grandmother on my mom's side, and my onion, my grandmother on my dad's side, and my grandkids call her onion, because that's when I say onion, they think I'm saying onion. I just thought that was so cute. And the red door, that's the house that's next to the restaurant. We had that built on so that, after school, we all worked at the restaurant. I trained the new waitresses. Yeah.
I mean, it was a kind of family enterprise,
Oh,
right?
definitely.
Yeah.
That we worked, and then my girlfriends who came to visit me, they would help me bust the tables.
And my
And
mother worked as a waitress there for a long time.
yeah, and my mother, one of her first jobs was working at for her father's onion ranch, and he was so kind. He would bring the onions to our house on Tout Street before we ever had the restaurant, and so that mom could do the work at home at Tout Street, because he would bring the onions. I didn't even know this until I was reading his oral history, my father's oral history. It's fascinating. And that's the restaurant, that part of the dining room, remodeled in the 80s. Unfortunately, I didn't I don't see my jukebox.
Oh.
I really love that.
Yeah.
We had, it was my own private record collection. Beatles,
Ooh, yeah.
Bob Dylan, Green Onions by Booker T. It was so much fun.
Yeah. I was wondering if you could speak about two things. One was what I mentioned in introducing you, which is that, you know, to no small degree, this is a step away from the fields. It's a restaurant, yet your family struggled so much that your brothers were placed in foster care.
What the two youngest ones,
Yes.
Belser and Belvin were like a couple years younger than me, and then 10 years, 15 years, right after we got the restaurant in, gosh, I must have been 11 or 12 then. It was so hard for my parents. They just didn't have the time. So I didn't realize then that it's not uncommon for Chinese parents to kind of ferret out their children to other places. And I must have written a note to my mother and father every single night, really obsessive at the age of 12. And I would welcome home, they come back from the restaurant. When are you going to be a good mother and bring my brothers home? Oh, gee, when I tried to make amends to my mom, like 50 years later, I finally became the daughter that she wanted me to become when I had to take care of her. And I tried to apologize for that.
Yeah.
And I brought it up. She goes, I go, remember all those notes I used to write to you every night for 6 years? And she goes, what notes? And I go, about you not being a good mother. And she says, just forget about it. God love her for that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
They
amazing.
worked so hard to
Yeah.
provide us, my brothers and I, American dreams.
Well, I know that all of you, like after hours, would party at the restaurant. You turn on like the music and,
Yeah.
but could you speak about how also in a place where there were very limited opportunities for people just to hang out? Like for laborers, the act of hanging out is criminalized, So, how did your family's restaurant serve as a kind of refuge
Well,
for different communities? And I've also seen, Lillian, all of you have photos of family members eating
Yep.
at Chinese
Yeah,
restaurants.
right. That's us. That's at our
Right,
restaurant.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that was pretty cool. Um, our parents were very active members of the Chinese community, and the officers and all of that. They were officers in Zhonghua Chinese school, and their pictures are still up in all the walls and stuff like that. And uh, I was really fortunate to grow up there like that, So
Yeah. Well, I think it also goes to a certain kind of resourcefulness. You create the spaces that you need.
I
You
think
know
we
what
were
I
so
mean?
young we didn't even know anybody. We
Yeah.
would just be knocking on doors and oh please, would you like to read this information or whatever? We, like fearless because we didn't know any better.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, we'll get to this in a moment, but it's also those community connections that enabled and supported to some degree your early organizing. So I want to move to another image. And, Vicci, I was wondering if you could speak about this. You have a story about this hotel.
Yeah.
Yeah, just briefly, this is at time, it might still be the biggest hotel in Salinas. It was in downtown Main Street, typical Main Street kind of everything kind of happened in Main Street. The main activity for youth was dragging Main. If you saw the movie American Graffiti, that was really kind of life for most teens in the 1950s and early 60s was dragging Main Street. Anyway, so just to make it short, when we decided to form our own chapter of the Farm Workers Union because there was none in Salinas and we couldn't believe it because we heard about, well, at that time it was called the National Farm Workers Association. They changed the name later. So I contacted Dolores Huerta, who was one of the co-founders with Cesar Chavez, right? And so she agreed to come to Salinas. And she said, but hey, we can't let the growers find out about this. And, we were like, little Adna said, we're all, young kids, 12, 13, 14 at the most. And we didn't, oh, okay. She says, well, so let's meet in the stairway. Because, they'll let us in, but she didn't want anybody to see her and know about it. And so we said, oh, okay. You gotta remember, we're like 12, 13. And I'd never been in that hotel, before, though, even growing up in Salinas, none of us, I don't think, ever had. So, we find it, and it's really dank, and nobody ever used it, and it's like, so we meet her there, and we said, fine. She goes, okay. So she told us what we needed to start and gave us, the buttons and flyers. And so after that, but other problem is like Lillian Spanish was probably the best of the three of us because I couldn't speak Spanish very well. But actually, at that time, farmers were very mixed because most of the immigrant farm worker labor was from Mexico, cut the Bracero program. So, but they were housed in shacks outside of Salinas. So it was very hard to contact them, on their own. So we had to wait till we were actually working in the fields alongside them to talk to the Braceros. But again, they're not citizens. So it was kind of I guess that's one of the reasons why the Farm Workers Union didn't organize in Salinas at that time, because a lot of the people didn't live. But there were other, including white farm workers, West Asians, people who get excluded a lot as farm workers, and of course Filipinos, who had actually already tried to unionize much earlier, like from the 30s. And people forget, if you've read Steinbeck's Grace or Wrath, particularly, in LSL also, were all the poor whites, people called the Okies, who had come during the Great Depression, and mainly from the South and especially Oklahoma, who settled in Salinas. So they were also, main part of the whole farm workers.
I mean, you stated that Steinbeck's book was banned, and but then you also stated that it didn't require a book to have you know that you were being economically exploited, right? And I wonder, you've also spoken, in our conversations about a teacher. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Because
Yeah.
I remember that sitting in the stairwell in the dark and people passing over us going, this is like we're having these. But for me, what really motivated it, Filipinos in the 20s and 30s and 40s really spearheaded a lot of the union organizing and the strikes. The grape strike in Delano was started by Filipinos. Those were my relatives. So here I am working in the fields. I'm in the 10th grade, 11th grade, and especially during summer. And then I'd have these people come. I thought of them as like college students because they were like white. They would come and try to organize us. And they would say, this is really stupid working for this type of pay. And I'm going, we don't have a choice. And I'd be really competitive because a lot of it is like peace. So the more and faster you work, the more money you make. And I was into like making money at the time and helping my family. And I'd be working along these people and they would wimp out after a few days. Because it takes you, once you're going back into the fields, it takes you a week maybe to get stronger and to be able to last through the heat and to just bear with that hard labor. They couldn't last a few days. I was just so disgusted with them. Like, come on, it'll get better, hang out there. And they come and spend a few days talking to us and then they leave. And this would happen over several summers. And what I picked up from that is that you cannot come from the outside and organize us. We have to organize ourselves. And so that's why we would start our chapter in Salinas, because it's the people who are going through that lived experience can organize themselves. And the one thing I always kept in mind and I felt guilty about is I knew I was going to leave. I was still enough where I had options where I could leave, whereas I know like some other relatives, especially this older man I knew who had a younger wife and 2 kids, they lived in a motel. They were never going to get out of that hole because all of his money went to the hotel and for food. But knowing that you could organize in this, but I had an option to leave. And I always think when people are community organizing, that sometimes you were part of the community, and you have to recognize at some point you're coming in to provide resources and to help, but you always have an out. And that sometimes builds distrust, because I would always say, you can always leave if you want to. So these people who would come in the summertime, and some of them, because they rarely would come because that's when their free time would be, they're not lifetime organizers. And so like that's when I realized we have to organize ourselves and make our own groups for it to be anything that's lasting.
Thank you. Thank you, Lillian. So I wanted to go to a teacher that you've all spoken about. And I've asked you, like one of the questions that I've asked the Three Musketeers is like, what sparked this? And of course, it's many things, right? But one of the sparks for their trajectory as radical organizers was a teacher. And I was wondering, Adna, you've spoken about how much the three of you revered Mr. Wilbur Morgan. And can you give us some sense of the impact that this teacher had on your political evolution?
I think it was in 1964 that we had him for history, and he was just one of those teachers that you wanted to go to the class. It was so interesting, and he was the first person that I ever heard about Vietnam with, and what I heard about it was terrible. It's 1964. We're just little teenagers, and it was wrong, and we knew it. And so that kind of started everything. Also, he was maybe one of the 12 people who was registered Democrat. I remember one time in class, he was looking, around the class, and looked like he was looking at the three of us. We didn't all sit together. And he said, it came to his attention, it was like Monday or a Tuesday in class. He says, somebody from the Democratic committee had let him know that over the weekend, they discovered that the Berry Goldwater bumper stickers, somebody was going around putting B-U-R-Y over the Berry. And he was looking right at us. And, I wouldn't even look at him in the face. I'm so glad that you didn't use the picture that we had of him
Repeat
with
offenders.
the crown. Yeah, it was so embarrassing. He was just a wonderful teacher, and I did when I graduated, I sent him a thank you card, but I never really got to tell him how important he was, how he was just one of those teachers that you really wanted to learn about, learn from. And like I said, he's the first one to tell us about the war.
So
You just said,
yes.
we had agreed, we're dedicating our presence here to Mr. Morgan, Wilbur Morgan, because we really believe that teachers are on the front line of the battle right now, especially around with ethnic studies. But
Just 1 second. Teachers in the house, please raise your hands. Teacher of any stripe. Teacher of any stripe, raise your hand. Yeah.
it's really, Mr. Morgan, I mean, we were, I think we were still in that direction, but he just helped us so much, the impact he had. He was the first person that we heard about Malcolm X from. Yeah. Nobody had talked about Malcolm X before because there weren't that many blacks in Salinas at the time. I think I met someone from Seaside here. You know that most blacks, because of the Fort Ord military base, more thorough people would stay in Monterey, and if they'd settle more in Seaside. But anyway, so there weren't that many blacks when we grew up going to our junior high or high school. And so, but he talked about Malcolm X, like, for God's sake. And we were, at that time, we were starting to follow Martin Luther King and, Why We Can't Wait and all this stuff, and the peace movement, the civil rights, NAACP. But then that's when we formed, our own chapter of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because it was at that time Stokely Carmichael was known as Torre now. But anyway, he and his other partner at SNCC coined the term Black Power. And man, because that was, I mean, we used to listen to James Brown and, all this other great stuff, Smokey Robinson and all the Motown stuff. And it was just like, oh God, nobody else is talking about any of this except for Mr. Morgan. So the impact that teachers have on somebody's life, you could be, I'm sure you already are somebody, many, many other Mr. Morgans, because we owe so much to him. And and for teachers who think just your job alone, you have an impact negatively as well by not doing anything. But the history teacher that, and I would just, oh, one other thing, I just have to say this because people, I know you guys fear, your jobs are on the line, and rightfully so. And that's why all power to you for the courage that you've shown, and also in even coming here to learn about how to fight what's happening, because Mr. Morgan was a victim of the McCarthyism. He was a history teacher. He should be teaching history. And not only that, he was one of the best history teachers ever. But for 10 years, they took that away from him. They demoted him with, not that there's anything wrong with physical PE classes. He had to teach PE classes for 10 years after the whole McCarthy period, because he was considered a red, a communist at that time. And we were lucky because we got him when they finally reinstated him to teach history. But there was a catch. It was history for dummies, because we were on the public school. They were experimenting with the fast track and accelerated classes at that time. And so we were supposedly we were supposed to take a history class by the college prep history guy who was an asshole and a racist. And so we asked if we could transfer to Mr. Morgan's class and said, but that's the dummies, the people, yeah. And so it was, I'm so glad that we did, because again, that's the impact that you people have on people like us.
I want to add that he just turned us on to looking at things differently. Like, I remember the questions: what were the causes to the Civil War? Lord help you, you put slavery as the number one reason, the first reason. And what were the causes to World War II, that kind of stuff. And he had a lot to do with our mindset. Like, the first demonstration I ever went to, march in Salinas, it was a sympathy march. Lillian and I were in, I think you were there too. It was a summer, my last summer school session before graduation. And it was a sympathy march after what had happened to John Lewis on that bridge. And we went on this march. It was the first first march I'd ever been on, down Main Street, down in Paso High School. And when I got back home, and my father said that he had heard about the demonstration. He goes, "That's where you were, huh?" And I go, "Yes." He goes, "You're grounded." So I was always getting grounded, but I still had to work at the restaurant.
What I pulled from Mr. Morgan is that, you talk about critical analysis. I went into his class, and if you'd asked me the question, why did the North win the Civil War? It's obvious. God was on our side. And at the end, I learned to really analyze the situation. What are the political forces that are in play at the time? What are the economic benefits to whichever side there are? What's the social political situation that is going on? Look at that entire scenario to be able to break that down for all the events you have. And so I brought that with me going forward. This is the 10th grade. This is a great teacher to be able to think and analyze that. And I recall that same situation when a friend of ours was accused of being an FBI informant when he was the first Asian to put guns into the hands of the Black Panthers. And people believe that. And I asked, where is the information you're getting from this? Just because we're old doesn't mean we're stupid. The source is the FBI. Think, people. And I remember getting that from Mr. Morgan. Who is giving this information about what's happening in Vietnam? The US military. Think about what the sources are and what are the other sources. So that's what I pulled from him. And what I got also from that, I always regretted that I never told him afterwards when I was in college or anything, what a great impact he had in how I viewed the world. Questioning always. And when my daughter was in high school, she had another great teacher like that. She was so fortunate. And I told her, tell him now about what a great influence he is. And then she went and told him before she graduated, and I spoke to him, and he died a few years afterwards. And then all these outpouring of students showed up. And she was so happy I had said that because, you know, at 10th grade, the impact teachers have on how you view the world and what the change, the possibilities for change that you can have. He really instilled that in us, and I carried that through life.
You know, I really appreciate what you're saying because oftentimes the way that structures of domination operate is through unsubstantiated allegation. So asking the question, where's the evidence, is so essential. It's part of our critical education. And, you know, I mean, he may have been farmed out to teach one kind of PE, but that was because he was doing the other kind of PE, which is political education. And so I was wondering if you could speak, like you came of age in this area that was so heavily militarized. And as you've spoken about, that we have our proximity to Fort Ord. But to think about how that really shaped the landscape, not only did it mean that those men who served in the armed forces who were from communities of color could potentially resettle in certain ghettoized areas. But Lillian, I'm also reminded of the fact that you said, well, when the vets came back, the jobs went to the white vets, right? You know, and but it also, there was a kind of echoing ricochet effect. You know, like I think about this too. You know, with when in 2021, when there was Atlanta spa shootings, you know, people who didn't understand the connections between what's happening here with US militarism in Asia, they don't understand that when, with US military bases in Asia, the area around US military bases, what Koreans call camp towns, that the names of local bars and businesses take the names of the American West. And conversely, most of US military bases in the United States are located in the American South. And around there, there are names like Korean names of businesses, but through the GI Bride Act, all these Asian women were also sex trafficked to the United States. So you can't understand the racism of that mass shooting if we don't actually think about the racism of US militarism in Asia and the fact that that takes the form of sexual exploitation. And so, Vicci, I'm sorry to ask you this, but can you speak about what it was like when people from the base would go into town on the weekend looking for a good time?
Yeah, I didn't think about that until you had asked it previously, but the first thing I wrote when after we founded the Asian American Political Alliance was a poem called So Long, Susie Wong. Because even though I wasn't a feminist at the time, that was a new term anyway. Back then, I don't know if it existed. But later on, when the feminist movement started in this country, it was mainly by white middle class women. So most of us in the third world women thought that was an indulgence, a selfish indulgence. We were more concerned with liberating our people and our communities. So we weren't really part of that. Although actually, when you think about where women hold up half the sky and all that came from, again, Maoist China at the time, if people don't understand. Yeah, historical materialism applies whenever you look at everything. Besides the sources, You have to understand what was happening, the context, whenever you look at something and say, oh, well, how could they support Mao in China now? Because everybody, oh, Mao's terrible. What happened in China was terrible, the Cultural Revolution. What happened in Russia, how could they have supported the Russian Revolution? Again, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater because you have to understand what was happening. Revolution was needed in all those countries back then. And things were different back then. And why we had the East doesn't mean it wasn't Chinese chauvinism. At that time, it was a code. Anybody who was involved in revolutionary activity in the 60s knew what that meant. That meant, hey, we stand for revolution the way People's War, the way it happened in China. You could go and see a picture in Life magazine of a hut in Nigeria where families with no electricity are sitting around, and what did they have on the wall was a picture of Chairman Mao. And they're reading the Red Book translated because that was considered the way out. That was considered the way forward as opposed to the First World, because what are we talking about in the Third World to begin with? The First World was by that time defined as America and the Soviet Union, which was no longer a revolutionary nation. It had become just as imperialist as the US. So this is, I'm trying to, what the background was of what all this meant. So how does this relate to, why did I think of that? The freedom from the stereotype of the Asian women, the Oriental woman, was the first thing I wrote about as my own emancipation declaration.
Yeah.
And sadly, I thought it would become irrelevant. But many years later, we made it into a song with my band in San Francisco called Repeat Offenders. And it actually, we won a demo tape thing. It was played around the area and alternative things. But then we got the word from the top, at that time called Progressive Underground Radio Station, and they refused to play it. And I said, what, why? And he says, oh, well, we talked to the program director. He said, because some of my fans were trying to get it played, and they said, he told us we're already playing an Asian song. I said, oh, there's a quota? I mean, it's not like, you don't do just one black song, for, like when James Brown was doing I'm Black and I'm Proud, hey, that's the only song we can sing about that, And they said, yeah. And I said, okay, well, what's the song that you're already playing? China Doll by David Bowie. This is San Francisco, considered the liberal, the radical outpost of the country. And they wouldn't even play ours. And to this day, I mean, but I was about 9, 10 then in Salinas, and that was, again, that was Main Street. It was everything that happened on Main Street. Our high school was almost on Main Street. So we could go, and cause more havoc and terrorize the community during our lunch hours, on Main Street, running up and down and doing all our crazy antics. And so the soldiers would flood. Salinas is the biggest city in Monterey County. So they have the movie theaters there, the bars, the brothels, everything. And so that's where everybody would go. There's no place else to go in Salinas. And I just always felt uncomfortable because I didn't want to know about, but you don't even know what it is, but it's cringy and yucky that there's guys are staring at you and propositioning you,
They taught me how to smoke cigarettes.
Well, yeah. So it's like, all this stuff. But you know what? Deep down, I also understood it. I wasn't mad at the soldiers because I had younger brothers. Both my brothers went to Vietnam. My brother-in-law went to Vietnam. And so they got drafted. But I understood, hey, I could actually even put myself in their shoes. If I was a young kid, 16, 17, and I'm thinking, hey, this could be my last time, not just in this country, but on Earth, because I'm being sent to some hellhole. I don't even know, I couldn't even tell you where it is on the map, to Vietnam. What would I be doing on my last night, or whatever, or just to blow off steam or something? But it
I
just,
mean,
again,
yeah.
the grip, the shadow of the military rule, and also that I had sent the postcard from Fort Ord at that time. You know what they sent for their promotional material? It was war training exercises where they're blowing up people. This was welcome to Fort Ord.
Right, right.
One,
Yes, please go ahead.
one experience I had, I broke my leg when I was in college, and then I fell after I broke my leg on crutches. So I went home to stay with my family in Salinas, and because my father was retired, my insurance is through the military, and so for physical therapy, I went to Fort Ord, and it was such a nasty scene because you had a lot of veterans coming back, and they were very wounded and had, very bad wounds and stuff. And a few times they would just start yelling and say, "Get her out of here. We don't want any gooks. Get her out of here. Get her out of here." And they'd say, "No, she's an American, Asian." But it would be just nasty where people would just come up to me and like start to push, and they'd have to bring in a PT person to come and, say, "Get away from her," and I would go through my physical therapy, and I could understand like the trauma they've been through. But then at the same time, you think, well, I grew up here in this country. And then my brothers would also tell me that sometimes when they would have to go through therapy, they're Asian. And they would say when they went through training, they were often said, "Well, you be the gooks, and then we'll practice attacking you," right? And so they got played into that rule. And then when they came back and then they were injured, they also get the same thing about why is he getting treated here? Like he's a gook, and goes, "No, he's an American and he fought in the war." So, but for people didn't see that distinction at all.
Mhm. You know, I guess I would just say, it's, I think that we're starting to recognize that with regard to US militarism, that, I'm so sorry about this, my goodness. But with regard to US militarism, there, when soldiers are deployed overseas, they have their overseas honeys. And in fact, it's a really, the entire, I think it's so interesting that the Ianfu system, which is associated with the Japanese Imperial Army, and it's translated as comfort system, to think about like that's affective labor. Comfort is affective labor. And to think that structures of violence depend upon a simulacrum of home away from home, the wives and honeys that are not your wives or honeys, and to think about how you know when you look at what succeeded the so-called comfort system in um, Asia after Japan's war defeat, and you look at the documentary evidence, you see that the term in Korean, it's not Ianfu, it's Wianbu. But you see that the term Wianbu is used by South Korean officials actually in their communication with US officials. And so one comfort system succeeded another, but wasn't recognized as such, and also had an at home manifestation. So it's interesting to think about that violence of having to provide quote unquote comfort to reproduce the structure of violence, right? And I think also, I was just wondering, Lillian, if you could speak about so you had a father who was a veteran, you had a brother who enlisted. Vicci, you had brothers too. And, but you were teenage anti-war activists. And could you just speak a little bit about how you negotiated those political tensions at home?
So you have a World War II veteran father, and relatives who are all in the military. And then you have a brother who was drafted. He was actually working in a farm in Delano. He got drafted, and then he decided he'd join the Marines. So, because he got drafted anyway. And the war is going on, and at that time I'm in Berkeley, and I'm in protesting, and I get arrested, or other things, and they're just like, we had very intense discussions about it, and when my brother would come home and leave, he'd be very, very upset with me for taking the stance because he was pro-American. And there is one incident that sort of like silenced all of that. I had gotten arrested in a stop draft demonstration in Oakland. It was the first time any of these anti-war demonstrations had turned violent. You know, they used tear gas, they came out with their SWAT, and they attacked people. And so at that time, they had printed everybody's names in the newspaper who got arrested. And so I know Vicci's and Adna's parents were very upset with them, and they heard from other people they'd be yelling at them and saying, "You disgrace the family." I'm not calling my parents and telling anything about this, right? And so at the day we're at the Oakland courthouse, and the courtroom is packed. You have all, I guess, 30 of us who had been arrested, and you have the attorneys there and the press there. And the judge just looks out at the crowd and goes, and we're all young. I think I was 19 at the time. And he goes, "Are there any parents here?" "Oh, I see parents. Come on down." So they come on down. It's my father, my mother, and Apo Tomas, an older man we used to hang out, you know, he was part of our family. "Come on down and sit in the jury box." Nobody else's parents show up. And I remember thinking at the time, how could they do this? This is so embarrassing. Nobody else's parents is showing up for this type of stuff. God, man.
Went to San Jose State.
Oh. So then afterwards, you know, we get sentenced and we're marching out, and you have to walk through this gauntlet of police and parents and reporters, and I'm going, oh God, there goes my parents. They're going to say something. And they had driven all the way from Salinas. And we had all these intense arguments about something. And then my father says to me as I'm going through, he goes, "If you need anything, call me." That's all he ever said about what that demonstration is about. And that silenced any discussion and arguments we ever had. It took me decades to really appreciate how much love went into that, because you know, you're young, like, nobody else's parent shows up in this type of stuff, you know, you purposely do it. But for a parent to show up and say that, and even though my brother, who is really into, you know, the Marines and everything, ironically, he comes around, he becomes a historian of Filipino history, and he writes about all of this farm labor, you know, Alex Fabros. And it was like, it was just so ironic. But I think that it was so intense at the time, and that sort of just captured, because I think he had a lot of, my dad and my brother, we know where you stand, we're going to respect it, and we're actually not going to get any further on this. And you know how we stand and what we believe in. We're just like, you know, we understand, and we're just not going to discuss it. So,
In fact, your brother said something recently, didn't he, publicly?
oh yes, my brother, we were at actually a veterans event and something, and I was there also because it was also a celebration of other things that were going on, and he says to the veterans, it goes, "This is my sister Lillian. I've learned that what she had said decades ago about the Vietnam War was correct." And I stood up and I said, for all these veterans, and I said, and I've understood that the way we treated the Vietnam veterans was incorrect, right? Because, you know, it took us a while to understand the PTSD and like just how so many of them became homeless. But I think that was sort of like a reconciliation of like our different views.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say that's an example of when I'm sure all of you gone through this, where you think it's hopeless. You try to change people's mind, or people tell you people don't ever change. No, people change. People really do change. their backgrounds, whatever, it's yours. All that's important. Because I had a similar thing. Both my brothers weren't as gung-ho as Lillian's brother was about entering the war, but they were, hey, pro-U.S., it must be right, So they went, without protesting or anything or trying to resist, because we were working with a lot of people. We helped get out of the draft by any means necessary, whether it was helping them to get to Canada or drinking a lot of soy sauce to flunk the med test or whatever. So we were doing a lot of anti-draft work. I don't know if you really understand what it was like, especially for
Drinking
young
lots
men.
of soy sauce. Okay. Sorry.
Yes,
Okay.
he was the one. Yeah, we went through that the whole night with him. That's how he got out of the physical. So we knew all kinds of ways to help, because that meant so much to us, stopping that damn war. Stopping, you see images just like what's happening now in Gaza and stuff. People, innocent people getting blown up to bits. Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire. We're in the belly of the beast. We have an extra responsibility to stop this goddamn war. So we're going to do it by any means necessary. And we're going to help all these young guys who want to get out of it. I don't care if they just want to get out of it to save their own skin. I don't care. That's one less guy sent to kill other people. And so, we did what we had to do, and I did the same thing. I felt kind of, people saying, don't you feel bad that I was writing anti-war letters to my brother. They said, aren't you supposed to be giving them moral support? They're in Vietnam. I said, but they know where I'm coming from. I don't want them to die. I want them to be safe. But if that means that they're going to have to kill some Vietnamese to stay safe, no, I'm not good with that. I'm not. I love my brothers. And actually, my older brother was saved by his racist CO, his commanding officer, because he was called gook and all kinds of names in the Army, and he shot him. He was shot by his CO during practice or whatever exercises, and that saved him because instead of getting killed, he got so severely wounded that they had to send him home. But I've heard all kinds of stories. I'm sure you've heard of fracking and people who just disobeyed and killed their own officers rather than go kill another Vietnamese. The ultimate draft resistor that we, loved so much was, of course, Muhammad Ali, who showed the way forward. I mean, what a stand he took in terms of third world solidarity, too.
Yeah.
Not to save his own skin. He did it in such a way, the beacon was lit right there. So we had, for us, it made all the sense in the world, And so people change. So one of the letters I posted also had Buffy Sainte-Marie's Universal Soldier in it, the lyrics, where it says how soldiers are just used as fodder for imperialists to go kill in every country. They're always and they're usually poor and people of color who are sent to do the dirty work of those in power. So my brother, who at that time still supported the war, he posted my letter, which was very vehemently anti-war, and on the bulletin board of his, he was on a little mining ship. And so he wrote me back and he said, I have to tell you, all the soldiers read it. They said they all agree with you. And I was stunned, first of all, that they let him post, his commanding officers let him post the letter, but that they had the feedback to tell him. So this is what's happening. People's minds are changing. The Vietnam War, particularly, because when they took polls of it back in '64, when most people didn't know where the hell it was, most Americans supported it. It must be right. Our government says we got to go there. It must be right. Well, within a few short years, it was totally against. Just like what's happening now in Gaza, where the majority of Americans actually don't support what the U.S. is doing. So things can change. People's minds can change. You think you might be talking to somebody who's totally going out your ear. We've met so many students at Salinas High who were not political when we were, who said, I wish they could post that thing that somebody wrote in your yearbook saying, hey, I met someone, and she goes, hey, you know what? You guys were right. Later on when I thought about everything, man, you guys were ahead of your time, because that war sucked. And it's gotten us in so many other things since then. But I just, again, it's just an encouragement. You think you might be, even to your students or other people or your family, you're not really, you really don't know when it could have an effect, on people and really touch them.
Yeah. Adna, I was wondering, I really appreciate what you're saying because, in a way, there's an echo here too. You know, um, that was a war that only moved to universal conscription like midway, but before that, there was a draft. And so people are sort of they are not sort of they are coerced into a structure of violence, and so to hear that feedback that those men who were there alongside your brother were like, we agree with your sister, that shows a certain kind of criticality even within the war machine. And I'm wondering, Adna, do you want to speak about any of these images, and can you tell us what they are?
I have never seen any of this before. And the summer before it stopped the draft week, we had already decided we were going to make the ultimate commitment to the movement by committing civil disobedience and sitting in an induction center. We knew we were going to get busted on August the 16th, 1967. Meanwhile, in the I think before the summer, I had written a letter to General Westmoreland telling him that I was against his war and I refused to cooperate with him. Sent off the letter. About a month later, I got a form from the Selective Service. Said, fill out this form. I just wrote across it, I refuse to cooperate with your war, sent it back to them. And then, like regular college students, it's the term's over, go back home or go wherever you're going, for the summer. And I didn't find out until like, you know, uh, 20 years later, one of my first roommate, apparently that summer, somebody from the FBI had come, or Selective Service had come to our apartment, was looking for A. Louie, and I wanted to know where he was.
Right.
And she said, and I find this out 20 years later, I don't know where he is. So then let's go back like, 7, 10 years later after that, I'm visiting my father. I guess this isn't like, it's before I went to Hong Kong in 74 or so. I'm at the restaurant. He goes, I had an interesting visitor. Somebody from the FBI named Mr. White came and wanted to talk to me about a draft resistor son that I have. And he goes, well, who do you want to talk to? I have 4 sons. The one who goes to San Jose State, he goes, that's my daughter. So they tried to draft me for like over 7 years before they found out I was a female. On those forms, there's no place that, that says male or female. And my brothers, Belser and Belvin, at that time, they had high lottery numbers, but before then you had to register. And I wasn't registered because, I'm not a guy. So, yeah. But it was so neat that my father was so amused. He goes, yeah, a Mr. White came, and he just said, no, that is my daughter. You've been looking for her all these years, and you didn't know?
So, I mean, this is a very, this takes us to one of our closing um, areas of focus for our discussion, which is basically in talking with you prior to today, Lillian, you had said the last thing that anyone wanted was publicity.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a social media generation. And there was no desire to have your name splashed in the local papers. And you said that your parents all read, the San Francisco.
Get thrown in the paddy wagon.
Right.
At San Jose State.
Yes. So, I mean, like, but actually, all of you did appear, right? And so, this is the thing, too, is that I was also, M and I were able to find archival newspaper clippings that indicate what the Three Musketeers were up to, right? And so, a lot of ethnic studies ethnic studies deals with the problem of the archives. And the fact that the archives are structured to reflect power, that they reproduce systems of dominance, that they lend themselves to the telling of stories that systematically exclude many of the movers and shakers of the masses, right? And so there's oftentimes a question of the problem of the archives. But there's also the issue that when is it that people who are structurally reduced to being nobodies in history, when do they appear in the historical record? Well, oftentimes it's in the collision with power. It's in the form of arrest records, right? And so there's something about this too where you're forced. Okay, on the bottom right is a photo that Lillian took, which is so cool of you basically running the anti-war leaflet table, right? But everything else is through the lens of media, which is anti-labor, which is, you know, in bed with the police, right? And I wanted to look at this too. And so I want to ask this because these are documents and we're talking about a people's archive. And I want to ask the Three Musketeers, how would you read these documents? And this comes from the FBI file for APA, the Asian American Political Alliance. And here you have this description, and it's a profile. Vicci Wong, misspelled, is described, and then this is the informant, SFT1, as a Chinese American undergraduate student at Berkeley. Records of the Oakland Police Department and of Berkeley reflect that she was born in California. She was arrested by Oakland police on October 18, 1967, while participating in these disturbances aimed at disrupting the function of the U.S. Army Induction Center at Oakland. In September 1967, I got Adna's permission before I put this up there. The owner of a Chinese restaurant at Salinas, California, advised that his daughter, a student at San Jose State, and her friend Vicci, address given, a student at Berkeley, were active in the summer of 1967 distributing literature opposing the U.S. military presence in Vietnam in connection with an activity called Salinas Vietnam Summer. Salinas Vietnam Summer. The 1968-69 Directory of the Associated Students of Berkeley lists Victoria Wong as a third-year student majoring in comparative lit, and then gives the address. And so this is an FBI file. It's drawn from COINTELPRO. How would you invite us to read this? And so, yeah, how would you invite us to read this? And then I want to show another. This is Salinas. Oh, yes, sorry. This is Salinas Vietnam Summer.
Oh, geez.
And the scratched out, like cross-hatched text that you see, and then the classification stamp. This was, you all produced a newsletter about the Salinas Vietnam Summer. You wrote about that. And you also include a list of names.
Well, we were trying to thank people for sending us money for stamps and stuff that we did. We printed 3 papers at Zhonghua Chinese School because my father was the principal. We still had the restaurant, but my mom used to teach school there, and Belvin did the mimeograph machine. But we listed all these people who sent us money, like our teachers, and we had no idea that they were getting investigated. And Belvin gave me this after, like, in the 80s, and I was stunned. And we got all these people with their underlying names in trouble for thanking them. We were so young, we didn't know that they would get in trouble. This is her art professor, my English professor, maybe is Mr. Morgan in there? I mean, we got so many people in trouble because we listed their names.
And they were all investigated by the FBI.
Yes.
And this,
Thank
so
you
Belvin,
for
her
asking.
brother, got this through a Freedom of Information Act request. And so even though you created this, you have to, you're forced into seeing how the feds are regarding you. So you can never be like the sort of gaze, the obscene gaze of power is
Consider
here.
where it's from. FBI,
Yeah.
you know?
I wonder how you would invite us to approach a document like this in a people's archive. Because not only do we archive those documents and images and material from below, that it's part of the struggle and part of the resistance, but we also have to look at these documents of barbarism from the feds here.
I have a comment about that. I used to be a history major at one point, and I have friends as who are aging out and passing away. And if you look at stuff like this, I say, he who writes, writes history. If you have an opposing view and you want to correct the history of it, you got to write about it. So like I know there's a number of us who are like finally writing something because you get one history that's written and that's not how it went down, right? And so when we look through these FBI files, and I've seen some on me, we would say that's not really what went down, but that's somebody's interpretation of it. So we need to be able to write and correct that. And sometimes, that history gets lost. And so sometimes when you see books that have been published, you're going, that's incorrect about some of the events. So I encourage as much as possible to write and do a counterpart to a number of things, or to clarify or give more depth to what actually happened.
Well, you know how you were talking about how if people change and stuff, that was the summer. I was still working at the restaurant all the time when I was putting anti-war and anti-draft literature in our restaurants to go orders. Oh my gosh, we got so many complaints. And of course, I would get grounded, but then the weekend would come again and I would be throwing in the anti-war literature, the anti-draft. And my dad would say, it was better when you were writing fortunes and the fortune cookies about your brothers.
Put in your own fortune. Oh, yeah, of course.
Anti-war
Oh, my God.
Yeah, my brothers put nasty things about me in the fortune cookies.
That's
Okay.
amazing. Like anti-war slogans and fortune cookie messages. That's
No,
so
and,
awesome.
And, no, my father made me stop doing it in the fortune cookies, so I just put in the to-go orders.
Right.
I did that the whole summer, and I kept getting grounded, but I.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Last thing, again, it's going to come all the time. Because if you're doing something that's working against the system, of course they're going to surveil you. Otherwise,
yeah.
if you don't want to get surveilled, don't do anything.
Yeah.
But hey, we've learned you don't even have to do anything. Because for people who say, oh, I don't have to be involved, if I'm not involved, okay, tell that to Wen-Ho Lee or some other non-white person who gets accused, or somebody who's driving while black. I mean, they weren't involved in any political activity. So, the thing is, again, you can't be scared by it. Of course, we were much younger, so I think that our naivete and our, just thinking we're immortal when you're young and everything didn't really. And the social media thing is very important now because we didn't have social media, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have internet, or anything like that. Plus, we did learn, though, it was a blunder to put people's names. We did it innocently. We thought we were trying to acknowledge all those people, but we learned quickly. No. And that's why to this day, I mean, it's a shame now, there's hardly any pictures of us. We didn't want pictures of us taken. If we saw somebody, we try and either break their camera or turn away. And we wore scarves, we do everything. We did not want to be known. We never signed articles for the most part. If you notice, if you read any movement, newsletter like Up and Down, I worked in a lot of papers. I don't have bylines. All the books I published, did not use a name, or you use a fake name, or you do it as a collective. You don't write your name, you don't help them. You know, they have to work for it if they're going to. Hey, we all still have piles of our own FBI personal files, but you can't let that intimidate you, you know, the thing. In some ways, maybe having social media now because everybody's on it. So, but at our time, because there was no internet, no anything like that, you know, I mean, I still, not only did we have landline phones, we had a party system where you shared a phone, so other people could be listening to your phone conversations.
Oh my God.
And I lived at Oppa. We were so stupid and innocent. I lived at Oppa Home, the headquarters. My personal address was the national headquarters for the Asian American Political Alliance. So I got all the mail. Everybody would come to my house at all hours of the night from all over the country showing up. So I know the excitement it caused, and I know I don't want to get into this other thing, the Fox version of the Asian American movement and how APA is denigrated, and that's a whole nother story, and I don't want to get into that here. But, you know, I just want to get back to also, how do you deal with that? Because you're always going to be surveilled, no matter what you do. But especially if you get into the kind of territory we're talking about, and they hate ethnic studies. Yeah. So, I mean, but how do you, in terms of what particularly Lillian went through, but actually all of us have gone through this in different ways about being blacklisted within the movement. That's kind of one of the worst things, because people that you look up to, when they turn against you because of lies promoted. Now, if you could understand what was happening in the 60s, why we were so paranoid, well, you know, hey, Kennedy was shot and killed. And he wasn't even a revolutionary. Then you had, you know, Martin Luther King, you had Malcolm X, you had Fred Hampton, you had Bobby Hutton, 71st youngest Black Panther. I mean, you know, everybody was getting shot and killed. And it was all, you know, nobody got prosecuted for it because they could do it openly by the state. Yeah. And so, anyway, this was happening, and we thought a revolution was happening any moment. The Black Panther Party was declared the #1 enemy in the country back then. So for people to tell me, I just have to laugh at them, otherwise I'm going to do something that I'll get sent to prison for, when they say that the Asian American movement and APA and UC Berkeley people, you guys were all just, you know, pampered revolutionaries playing at revolution. Oh, you career opportunists who say that to me? You're pimping off the struggle that we fought for third world liberation into this new academic discipline of ethnic studies, selling your books, selling your so-called expertise, while you're promoting, whether you want to or not, by ignoring our true history of struggle, you are promoting the imperialist, reactionary, ruling class history. And like Lillian always keeps telling me, because I'm on a mission about this, we have to write our own history. But again, in saying that, you know, I want to go back to also how do you, because the COINTEL program, if you've heard about it, it's just mass murder. I mean, they didn't just stop at this country, right? Just last year, the CIA finally admitted they killed the democratically elected president of Iran. If you want to talk about what the hell is going on in not the Middle East, the colonialist term, but in West Asia, it's because of what the Western imperialists did there. To this day, we got to learn our history. We got to teach that history to people. And this is what they keep trying to tell us, divide and conquer. That's the easiest way for them to infiltrate us,
Yeah.
divide and conquer. And you know we have to fight that? How do we fight that? Solidarity.
Yeah.
Solidarity together forever, broadening the struggle. You know, not just sticking to narrow nationalism that could happen even within the third world and has happened. But the three things I always use that has helped me, again, that I deduced from Mr. Morgan and my own experience of organizing and doing stupid mistakes like naming people's names, you know. Whenever I hear a rumor maligning someone as a spy, because that's the other way they do it, okay, you know the worst thing to do for a revolutionary is to accuse them of being a spy for the FBI.
Yeah.
That's the worst way to ruin somebody's, you know, whole career, for most part, idiots believe it instantly, even though, again, please keep this in mind. I devised this way to how to go through the lies. One, consider the source. Consider the source of any kind of rumor that you hear. Two, consider the timing. Why did they come out with this accusation at this particular time in history? One thing I agree with Marx on was historical materialism. What does that mean? Apply everything to the conditions around you at that particular time in history. Because that is the only way you will understand why people did the things they did in 1963 or in 1942. You can't use what's happening today to go back to why somebody would have a revolution in China in 1949 and follow the Chinese Communist Party. You can't understand that using today's criteria. So you have to use historical materialism. Anyway, number two, so consider the timing when they attack. When something comes out when, say, Black Lives Matter is happening, and then they attack the Black Panther Party and accuse somebody of being a spy or whatever, are they trying to delegitimize the Black Panther Party, maybe? Hey, yeah, maybe that's what they're really trying to do, is delegitimize an authentic leader. Number three, who benefits? Who benefits from these accusations? Yeah. And I can tell you almost every time, it's not we the people. Because if you'll believe these kind of accusations like they were having against, like, especially that they sown among the Black Panther Party of accusing each other of being spies or whatever, what does it do? It destroys the organization. It destroys our trust. They win again.
I mean, you just laid out the critical methods of ethnic studies. You have to consider the source. You know, you have to contextualize it within a terrain of power. And you have to consider who stands to benefit from that. And, you know, and I totally hear and feel your critique of ethnic studies because, you know, one of the reasons why this conversation is so important is that ethnic studies, through that trajectory of being institutionalized, has succumbed to both a kind of respectability politics, but also divide and conquer logic. So almost from the beginning, when ethnic studies was formed as a field at the university level, instead of there being a third world college, that possibility got totally stripped from the outset. Instead, everyone who was there, who was a student who developed the curriculum, was exfoliated from the project because they couldn't make it through the eye of the needle of tenure. And who gets to determine that? The entire university at large, right? Like this sort of predominantly white institution on the level of faculty. That remains the case today even, let alone 50 years ago. And so you could see how ethnic studies, how the anti-imperialist, radical, revolutionary spirit and praxis of the field was so fundamentally challenged in its trajectory. And we're in a historic moment in which Newsom, yes, signs into law AB 101, but simultaneously capitulates to lobbying groups that do not represent majority interests in California. 80% of the student population are students of color, right, in the state. And he places guardrails around ethnic studies and says all that was excised from the draft version of the model curriculum, that was purged from the official version of the model curriculum, cannot be taught in ethnic studies, and that those areas that were purged represent bias, bigotry, and discrimination. Well, the model curriculum is 700 pages long, and most teachers don't have the time to sort of sift through things to see what was purged, but we all know what was purged. And that was any mention of Palestine. That was any mention of the fact that Palestine is occupied. That was any mention of the fact that Palestinians are subjected to a system of settler colonialism and apartheid. And there was mention also of BDS. And that was in the first draft. That gets purged because any affirmative mention of Palestine or Palestinian right to existence and resistance, and let's be clear that international humanitarian law, which I'm not saying is like the be-all, end-all of things, but international humanitarian law enshrines the right of occupied people to resist. It doesn't enshrine the right to commit genocide. And but we are being told that any affirmative mention of the Palestinian right to existence is anti-Semitic. And so there is a repressive guardrail that has been placed around ethnic studies during this moment of expansion. So I think having clarity about what the project of ethnic studies was about, and there's a reason why Ronald Reagan, who was governor, deployed the National Guard against all of you. It wasn't because he was like, oh, they're going to throw a little bit of race into the curriculum. He understood that there was a revolutionary threat and that there was a worldview that imagined liberation for the greatest possible collective of people. And that includes white people. Okay, so like I wanted to say something, and we're running out of time, but you were part of this amazing anti-imperialist conference in Montreal, and you were all essential. I mean, Vicci and Lillian were there. They were photographed. They were in the Montreal papers, and they also argued for the Black Panther Party to be included in those proceedings. Okay, so but there's solidarity, right? Solidarity animated this work. Solidarity must animate our work right now too. And I just want to end with a sort of moment of levity because this comes from the FBI file. Issue number 3 of the APA newspaper has a short untitled article signed Wong, which uses a stream of consciousness method of describing American movie and television ideas about Oriental women, and then has the quiet, gentle, docile, clean Oriental woman take a gun and shoot for political power. Article ends stating, Oriental women annihilated, Asian woman alive and well, smiles. According to SFT1, Wong is Vicci Wong. Vicci, could we have that article for our archives? So I think I would just like to close by thanking you all so very much for this incredible conversation.
I just want to say
Yes.
one thing to that. Remember I said consider the source before you believe that? And the timing.
We had fun though, huh?
Yeah. Everyone, please join me in expressing our respect and appreciation for the 3 Musketeers.
Oh, my goodness.
That's why the Three Musketeers are three. Okay? This is solidarity in action, okay? Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much. Oh, let's be careful with all. I'm going to actually move these. But please join us for lunch. Thank you all for coming.